Fraud, the one word which no department or organisation wants to hear in relation to them. And now with new legislation, the onus is on us even more than before to detect it. So what to do? Here to talk about that, I'm delighted to welcome Dan Cashen, who is the Chief Product Officer of Fiscal Technologies. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. It's like you say, it's a subject close to everybody's heart.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of those things. And I think sometimes you think that it's not going to happen in your own organisation. And that's, as we'll probably talk about a bit later, where some of the problem lies. But fraud is often talked about as something of a growth industry in the UK. Why do you think that is?
There's a multiple of factors that bring into that, though, isn't there? It is certainly growing. I think part of it is our ability to detect it and report on it, means that we can actually have a greater visibility of the levels of fraud. I think, as always, the number one thing is opportunity. Yeah, the opportunity for fraud. You've got shrinking teams in those finance teams or within organizations as a whole. That means that the opportunity for everybody, everyone's stressed at work, everyone's trying to get more done with less resources, or there's a greater dependence on technology. I'd say the changes post-COVID and remote working still has an impact to play. I would say there's removal of barriers. I mean, you have the internal fraud, so you've got the team sizes, the team structures, remote working. You've then got external factors, like fraud at scale is how I think about it. You've got entire teams just sitting there putting a tax on companies, trying to defraud them, whether it be suppliers putting in, fake suppliers putting in pretend invoices, or the lovely ones we all love, that is it about your CEO being stuck in an email and you must sign this off quickly. So it's just getting far more complex. So there's a good old-fashioned fraud that we're very good at detecting. But then you've got teams just using things like Gen AI and new technologies just for nefarious aims. I'd say the last thing that always comes in, as you know, is the economic situation. So when you've got economic squeeze, whether it be for an individual, you know, they might have that one-off opportunity that they lean into a little bit too much, and that one-off that they've proved that they can do something almost becomes habitual because they're just incredibly stressed with, you know, mortgages, loans, everything else. But then you've got that corporate stress as well, where companies may not have had the sales they've needed or the results they've needed, and that opportunity for a little bit of that corporate adjustment that is also fraud, maybe in their reporting or maybe how they count or classify. I think it's just an awful lot more opportunities out there. So I think that all leads to its growth.
Yeah, and I think that probably everybody listening to us today can recognise some of those factors in some of the elements that they have maybe come across in their own organisations of fraudulent activity. We ran a survey in the beginning or the first half of this year, which showed that there was a large evidence of fraudulent activity taking place within companies that are touched to or a part of PPN network. So it is happening, and it's happening for those reasons that you suggest. So whose responsibility should it be to prevent this type of fraud from happening?
I mean, I'm going to go for the old cliche, which is it's everybody's responsibility to prevent fraud. I mean, but it is true. Everybody has their part to play. I mean, we could start with HR, someone on their journey. Has the vetting been completed? It's amazing how many companies we work with that maybe their vetting isn't as robust. Or do you want to pick on procurement, going, have you actually selected the right vendors and suppliers? Or do you want to be more brutal and go, when's the last time procurement or AP actually undertook an ongoing check on that supplier? You could have a look at IT. Are the right checks and balances incorporated into the technology stack that they're using? Does the audit function, if you want to go that far? Does it actually have the teeth to get the job done and actually do the investigations? Or is it really a paper-based audit, internal audit function? Or culturally, do you as an organization even have the correct culture where someone sees something? Are they in a safe environment to say something, either to their manager, to their manager's manager if they want to skip, or can they whistle blow? So I would say there's a lot of things going on, and quite often people will have seen warning signs to fraud, or they will have had an inclination, or the reporting may have pointed in a certain direction. People just need to take responsibility corporately as a collective. Combating fraud can be more of a team sport. Everyone has a part to play, I think, from the beginning of a relationship all the way through the life stage of that relationship at multiple levels within that organization.
Yeah, and I think that's so right. And I think that's probably something that organizations can do to make sure that holistic approach is
Hmm.
something which is first and foremost their strategy for protecting against fraud. Because when you're looking at it in maybe kind of individual or departmental silos, there's always going to be an element that gets missed. And just listening to you speak there, I think it's so important that people feel that they're able to do something about it themselves, not think, oh, okay, it's not really my responsibility. It's not part of my job description to look out for that. If they kind of see something, 9 times out of 10, people listening to us today will no doubt have seen some of the stories that we share across PPN. And a lot of the time that is actually detected does come from that kind of, I've just noticed something a bit strange, or that whistleblower effect.
Indeed. I mean, how many times do we pick up the newspaper? Sorry, I am old. Or read a news article, and you find out that somebody from an organization somewhere is clearly living beyond their means.
Mhm.
Yeah, the number of holidays, the cars, the whatever. Some people are more sophisticated with that, but there's often those indications that give a little bit of warning signs internally.
There'll be some telltale signs the longer it
Yeah.
goes on, for sure. So, I mean, do you think that it's partly it could be that it's easier to detect now? And do you still think, or do you still think there are some elements of fraud or big scale of fraud that's still going undetected?
I think there's some very traditional types of fraud that everyone is far better at detecting. Yeah, I think people are looking far more at internal collusion.
Mm.
I think people are often able to detect, I don't know, payments made to employees' bank accounts, yeah, who are pretending to be a vendor or supplier. So the basic unsophisticated, run-of-the-mill kind of internal fraud, I think we're far better at finding. I think training has improved and awareness is far higher than perhaps it's been. I think you've still got the impact and reputational risks that are still great to the organization, which helps drive that training and that need.
Mm.
But I think where we all struggle is there's far more sophistication than there used to be. You know, it's far easier to put together a sophisticated attack than it used to be. Yeah. And I'm not always sure that the preventions have kept pace with the emerging technologies. I mean, you're having entire companies there that, as we spoke of earlier, are just sending out emails to try and trip people up.
Yeah, and I guess it only takes one, doesn't it? They're sending, there we are in our own individual organizations, but they're sending out loads of spam, and it only takes one of those to work, and then they're straight in there. So as you say, it's quite a complex environment. And I
Yeah.
think for us in our organizations, to some extent, that's going to get a little bit more tricky and perhaps more personal, isn't it? With the upcoming new legislation, which I mentioned earlier on, with the new Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. Maybe, if you can just give us a few pointers about what that act is aiming to achieve.
It's um it's a fairly wide-ranging act. I mean,
Mm.
it's impacting what you classify as large organizations. So an organization to be impacted by it has to have, I think you have to make 2 out of 3 thresholds. So you have to have more than 250 employees.
Mhm.
You have to have a turnover in excess of, I think it's 36 million, or your balance sheet needs to be larger than about 18 million. I guess the largest change that it's driving is it's classifying it about failure to prevent. And I think that's the important nuance. It's looking at who is accountable and responsible for preventing the fraud, or not just fraud. It can be bribery, it can be tax, it could be money laundering, false accounting. And I think what it's doing is it's cascading down that responsibility, yeah, to bring in senior managers and not just at that CEO level. It also broadens the net about the areas that are responsible. So it's bringing in the CFOs, the heads of department, anybody in a kind of pseudo-strategic role.
Mm-hmm.
But it encompasses a far wider remit rather than just a company. It could cover any employee, any subsidiary that you might deal with or have. Yeah, so that subsidiary could be found guilty, and by proxy, you as the parent company are responsible. The suppliers that you trade with, how are they dealing ethically? The contractors that you use. And it's kind of trying to make sure that everyone is jointly accountable for the behaviors of that company. So it could be payroll. Historically in the UK, there's been things where payroll have diverted funds from pensions and put it into projects. Well, that's absolutely not a thing that can be done. Or the scientific community, who's checking the results of their tests that might go some way to driving up, if you have an inflated result of a test, does that drive up company value? That then effectively fraudulently overvalues the company. Or your sales team, we all have sales teams, yeah? Are they mis-selling? Yeah? Are they deliberately mis-selling and people know about it? And does that help overstate a company value? Or the one I quite like is procurement. You've got procurement. Again, they're on top of their suppliers, but if you're saying you're a very green, ethical company, but you knowingly know that you've got sanctions against one of your key suppliers, yeah, against environmental dealerships or dealings, then you are responsible for being able to state that. Yeah. But I guess the biggest, there's two ways out of it. There's two main kind of defenses. And the first thing is, if that fraud of maybe overstatement or something else has got the company as the target, then it's very unlikely that the senior management were there trying to drive the value of the company. Yeah. Or the most basic and obvious one is the same as most things we have, which is it's failure to prevent is the wording that they use within the law. So your defense could be that you have a robust framework. So have you got reasonable fraud prevention procedures? Yeah. So it comes back to the point we were talking about earlier about shrinking teams. Well, actually, have you got a framework where you've undertaken some due diligence to understand your shrinking teams? Do you have some roles where they have a great opportunity and very little oversight?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So that risk assessment that you start to do, how do you cascade that through? So do you have a risk assessment of people, roles? Have you got good due diligence on your suppliers or your vendors? Have you got a code of ethics that everyone can understand how they should be trading? So I don't think there's a lot here that companies don't have or do. It's about, do you have the evidence that a lot of this is undertaken, updated, yeah, and adjustments being made corporately if they need to be done?
Mm-hmm.
But in essence, what it's trying to do is make sure it's trying to keep companies honest. And it goes back to that point we said before about just small frauds. Well, actually, this is really talking about much larger corporate fraud. Yeah. So is everyone behaving ethically and correctly? Is it being discussed at a board level? Is it being tracked? Is it being monitored?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are the risks known? I think that's really, it's just trying to make corporates responsibility for their own results that they're publishing to make sure there's no overstatements.
Yeah, and I guess trying to is the UK trying to put a ring fence around the larger corporates, that are, I guess essentially, we've got the majority of the businesses in the UK are those small businesses which are the sort of driving wheels of industry. But we've got those larger corporates which are, responsible for a lot of the weight of the economy. And I think that this act is just trying to prevent some of those situations that we talked about before we went live today around the problems that happened with Carillion, for example, and just trying to prevent that happening again. So
Absolutely.
do you think that it's going to be effective in making organisations take more responsibility.
Absolutely. I believe the fact that companies are now reporting on it, companies are having to mitigate for it. I'm a firm believer if it's tracked and it's monitored, then something is done because you can start to quantify and qualify.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've already brought up Carillion, you've got British Home Stores, you've got various other large organisations that looked particularly healthy on their audit and looked particularly healthy on their annual report, but underneath absolutely were creaking. And I think what it's trying to do is drive change to ensure that where we have healthy companies, they really are,
Mm-hmm.
especially if people are buying stock shares and trading in them, or they're about to undertake um, big transactions with them. I mean, Carillion was a big shock to the government as well. So it's just trying to make sure there's a little bit of resilience.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And I guess transparency as well. I mean, you
yes,
talked
yeah,
there
yeah.
about, Carillion being a big shock to the government. And I think that one of the issues there, that everybody else thought that everybody else had control of the situation, whether with the banks, the government would help, and the government thought the banks would help, etc. And it ended up being something which nobody had ultimate control or visibility of. And I think, I guess, an act like this is trying to prevent that happening again and make sure that you've got those reporting levels in place as they should be. But what
Absolutely.
about those organisations which are out of scope? You talked that the Act was mostly aimed at those larger corporates. Can those smaller organisations afford to sit back a bit?
I don't think any organisation, when regulatory change comes afoot, it normally starts at the top and cascades downwards, as we
Mm-hmm.
know. So if I was thinking myself and it was my organisation and I was a tier below or a tier below that, I'd start preparing now. I mean, if you think about it, the behaviours they're looking for are perfectly healthy.
Mm.
Yeah. There is no reason why you can't sit down with your audit team or your person responsible for audit and start preparing. Yeah. It's not difficult to do an internal risk review. Maybe you start with your suppliers. Yeah. Do they still stack up? Yeah. Do you still understand their health? When was the last time everybody had a health check?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a look at your roles and responsibilities? Do you have some obvious roles within your organization where people might have too much influence and control? I mean, there is nothing that would prevent any organization taking those few simple checks. And if you start to lay the groundwork now, by the time the regulations come down to you, you've moved your diligence upwards to meet those regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my rules would be get started, understand the landscape of where you are and
Mm-hmm.
see what you can do.
Yeah, and ultimately it's about protecting your own organisation and getting it ready to be in a position where it can grow and become more stable, isn't it? So, as you say, it kind
Absolutely.
of makes sense that even if you're not a part of a larger organisation which needs to, adhere to this new law, it makes sense to put your own house in order to the same extent, I guess, doesn't it? I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
of course, fiscal technology is one of your core products, is around protecting organisations against fraud. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that and the type of fraud that it helps to protect against.
Absolutely. I mean, at Fiscal, we have a platform that does multiple aspects against transactional fraud or employee fraud, or whether it be supplier fraud. I guess employee fraud is the one that's the easiest when you're talking about fraud. And
Mm-hmm.
it enables you to check your suppliers and see whether your suppliers are also linked or have correlations back into your employee base. And it's a very simple binary check, but it's amazing how many times it comes up that people don't understand the relationship between a supplier and an employee. Or we've spoken about suppliers and the health of them. We often see that our customers will undertake a good due diligence check when they set up a new supplier,
Mm-hmm.
but they have no understanding of the health of that supplier once they're up and running. So allowing companies to undertake something and have a very simple threshold of credit. What's a credit line we're happy to deal with? What's our credit score? And any supplier that drops below that, well, actually, you might want to just go and take a check because they themselves might be under financial stress.
Mm-hmm.
We obviously match things like invoices that come in to make sure that they can get invoices that come in to make sure that they get paid effectively and efficiently, and they're not being asked for twice. Yeah, it's amazing how many suppliers are under some form of financial stress themselves. There's a correlation between that and the number of, how should we put it, accidental duplicate invoices that come in. And they're all slightly nuanced and slightly different. So having something with an ability to understand what to look for and spot these trends and help you understand how to be more robust, it's just a fairly fundamental basic check that supports this emerging regulatory change.
Yeah, I guess it's almost like having somebody else at your side, isn't it? Just looking out for everything that's coming through your organization, just to check before you then make that payment, isn't it? For example, if you're talking about duplicates, for example, you've got that piece of technology by your side.
Check, though, isn't it? We've spoken before about how resources are the scarcest thing often within teams, and the fact that we just check every invoice, every transaction, every day, just means you know that what you're paying, is safe to be paid away, and that you're not wasting any of your revenue by paying something twice that you then may, if you do identify it, have to later recover. So it's about time, it's about efficiency, it's about saving. But to me, it's about simplicity. Yeah. The part of the regulations around making sure you've got your master supplier file, making sure your due diligence is up to date, making sure you know who you're trading with. Well, it's just always on with our software. So once that supplier is loaded in, we're checking them every day for any changes, whether it be bank detail changes, which might be an indication of fraud, whether it be for employee matches, an indication of fraud, whether they've got any sanctions checks, whether they've got any credit changes. And it's just always on, always checking. So resources being tight is no longer just an excuse. Just let the software pick up some of that load for you. And that's all to support AP teams.
Which makes perfect sense, and I guess gives organizations that level of certainty that you need. And ultimately, companies who are looking out for fraudulent activity in the ways that we've talked about in our conversation, it's not just about protecting against fraud and protecting against any errors that might be happening. It's also tightening other controls across that whole procure to pay process. And if people are looking to fix their current model, where would you say is the best place to start, or what kind of advice would you give them?
It's such a wide spectrum, isn't it? I think the first piece of advice is whatever you do as an improvement is don't delay. But again, I'll go back to start with a simple audit. Maybe you want to audit the basics, no PO, no pay. Maybe you want to audit how suppliers are set up. Maybe you do want to audit and understand, like we say, people with too much of a remit of control that don't have any oversight of them. Maybe you want greater reporting to understand where you're weakest and where your threats are. I'd start with some form of internal risk review. What are your concerns? Where do you not have ample protection? And then I would start just plugging that hole. Yeah. I mean, obviously, come and talk to Fiscal and we can do a risk review with you and help you understand where you are and where you aren't. Yeah. And help you put in place a number of controls that are there. But I think most people know where they have some light or chinks in their armor. I don't think there'll be surprises to many organizations where they think they're weakest, or knowing where, if they're honest, somebody might have too much sign off, or might be a single point who's able to do more. Where we find fraud, as we said at the beginning of this, just to bring it all the way back, it's often known within the organization, or they have people thinking about it, or assuming that somebody is living beyond their means. Yeah, so I would have a look at who has opportunity, and therefore how do you remove that opportunity or put a little bit of protection around them. Yeah, and whether that opportunity be in your sales team or be in your AP teams, yeah, I would look at how do you track and how do you monitor it. Where it's suppliers coming in, I think we have some fantastic software that can tell you whether they have any changes in situation or circumstances. We can tell you about changes to things like bank account details, which would be a leading indicator. Yeah. We would tell you whether that matches to one of your employees, which again would be an absolute red flag. So have a look at your problems, have a look at your risks, and then see what are the solutions that can be put into place. But I would say this regulation is going to cascade downwards. I would say every organisation and every company should be starting that review today.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Dan. And that sounds like a perfect place to end our conversation today. You know, look, if you've got anything that you want to discuss further, I'm sure, Dan, you'd be more than willing to help anybody who's listening to us today and have got maybe some concerns of their own. But it sounds to me like people need to map their existing processes, look out for any weaknesses, and check where they want to be, those sort of final outcomes as well. But thanks very much, Dan, for the conversation, and thanks to everybody for listening to us today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.